for joining us, both Dr. Russo and Dr. Mason. And I think we'll start with Anne's presentation.
Welcome, welcome. I said I'm so glad that we have a nice group here, and thank you so much, April, for inviting me. And I'm so honored to be talking also with Stephanie. How wonderful to meet you, Stephanie, in the context of this. And I think it's wonderful to, I don't think at the university there's very many spaces where people in women's and gender studies come together with people who are in accounting. And so, so I appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation with you. And, I look forward to more. So Stephanie and I had agreed that I would begin by talking about some of the ways that women's and gender studies approaches these questions of identity, culture, and racial justice, sort of generally. And because these are questions that we think a lot about in women's and gender studies. And so I'm going to start there. So I'm going to begin by bringing in an older feminist text by Simone de Beauvoir, a French feminist, whose book, The Second Sex, was published in the 1950s. And I'm going way back, and in many ways, a lot of these ideas have changed. But I don't know, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about her line in the book, a famous line where she says, "One is not born a woman, one becomes a woman." And I think it's a powerful framework around identity because it makes us aware that who we are is not biologically determined, like that a lot of these categorical identities have been socially defined and there's not any kind of biological necessity around them. And also that we're always in a process of becoming, and that the process of becoming is a social process, a political process, a historical process, and it's a situated process rather than a generic one. I think that's really important to think about, like how we think of ourselves and how others see us is very much a social and cultural phenomenon, and that how we see ourselves changes over time, and also how others see us changes over time. And it makes us think also about what it means to, become a woman is really different depending on who we are, the particular social, cultural, political, historical, geographical context that shapes our identities, our experiences, and our life histories. Whatever we're becoming, it's shaped by all of those things. It doesn't mean one thing. And so our gender identities are, like I think about my own gender identity is totally interconnected with other social identities, my race, my ethnicity, my, religion, sexuality, class, citizenship, educational status, all of those things. And also our life history and all of our experiences. Like sometimes I think in this society, we're meant to think of ourselves as individuals. And those of us who may be privileged in this system or dominant in the system, in the dominant culture, are really encouraged to always see ourselves as individuals and sort of outside of a social and cultural context. And I think that's a real lie. Like all of us are shaped by these, by who we are, how others see us, and our upbringing and our experiences. And I think women's and gender studies really asks us to think about that and take responsibility for who we are and where we are in this world. So here I'm calling upon what we often call in women's and gender studies, it's like an intersectional approach to equity and justice. It's an approach developed by Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and other feminists of color. And the term intersectionality actually was coined in, I think in 1989, by Black feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. This frame, although the ideas of intersectionality you could take back, a couple hundred years. The framework of intersectionality gets us to think about our identities and our experiences as shaped by social locations, but within interlocking systems of oppression and privilege. So we're talking about hierarchical systems based in gender, as well as race, as well as class, as well as sexuality. There's also ability, there's etc. Intersectionality calls us to recognize that no matter who we are, we're impacted by these systems, we're shaped by these systems, whether or not we're oppressed or empowered within them, and that we're also implicated within them. We've internalized them. We treat others from within these systems. In other words, in the words of Shireen Moraga in the book, This Bridge Called My Back, we are all both oppressed and we're also complicit in others' oppression. And that's that concept of intersectionality gets us to think about that. And so I think about my own process of becoming, initially as a young white girl growing up in a white upper middle class Catholic community in an Italian and Irish descent, very patriarchal family in a racially and class segregated and medium-sized university town in central Illinois in the 1960s. A time when these hierarchical systems were being challenged and in the process of change, as they always are, and also being resisted, right? Those challenges were also being resisted. So as a child growing up at that time, I felt like there was so much wrong with the mistreatment and violence I was experiencing, in and outside of my family, but also witnessing. But didn't have the language and analysis to really name and understand it. So going to college, becoming a feminist was life-changing, providing me with more language to be able to name it as like sexism, homophobia, sexual assault, racism, classism, homophobia, etc. And it was through becoming part of anti-racist, multiracial, and queer feminist movement that I came to a deeper understanding of how much my background and identities continued to shape and influence who I am. Because I think when I initially gravitated to feminism, it was really around addressing sexism and homophobia, violence against women. Those are things that I'd experienced firsthand as a woman, and then as I came out as a lesbian. I didn't realize, how steeped I was in the culture and systems of racism and classism and other forms of oppression, because I think I thought that it was just about, being biased or having, thinking about stereotypes, but I think it's a much more internalized system of norms and ways of behaving and ways of thinking of ourselves in relationship to others. So it's a much deeper process, and that I needed to figure out not only how to mobilize around oppression, but also around privilege and dominance to disrupt that in the ways that it was showing up in my life and in my work. So part of being a multiracial, in a multiracial, queer and anti-racist feminist community and movement, I started shifting everything. So shifting out of just focusing on sexism and to recognize and take action from a place of the recognition of being in these systems of dominance as well. So rather than focusing on shared experiences of oppression, I learned to listen for the differences among and between women and queer people, and not to write off those differences as unimportant or irrelevant or not connected. So I'll just give an example of not evaluating. For instance, people will say, well, you're in women's and gender studies, you're the director of the Women's Center at DePaul. So what's the status of women at DePaul? And I always say, well, I have no idea. Like, I couldn't base my assessment of that on my own experience, because I'm a particular, I'm a white woman, I'm a professor, I'm, I don't know, I have all these, I have all these specific ways that I'm situated in the university. And it's a problem to kind of think, well, this is how I'm doing at DePaul. So therefore, that's how all women are doing at DePaul, even thinking that I could assess my experience in relationship to others. And I think that's where we've gotten into trouble, where sometimes some feminist work makes this assumption that women are the same. It's a homogeneous group rather than looking at how different we are, and that those differences are also connected to systems of race and class and sexuality, etc. So it was really the Black feminist author Audre Lorde who I learned so much from and continue to learn each time I read her. And if you want to read a great book of essays by Audre Lorde, I would suggest Sister Outsider. In that book, she really calls for feminists like myself to recognize the differences between us rather than only focusing on similarities. As she writes, quote, "Certainly there are very real differences between us of race, age, and sex, but it's not the differences between us that are separating us. It is rather our refusal to recognize those differences and to examine the distortions which result from our misnaming them and their effects upon human behavior and expectation." And so for those of us who are white, Audre Lorde called for us to become accountable for our location in these social hierarchies, our role in the inequities and injustices that are around us. Because by ignoring them or just thinking, oh, we're all on the same page or we all have the same experience, we're really ignoring how these systems are actually dividing us and continue to divide us. And also where we're actually maybe contributing to those divisions or complicit in them. And while bearing witness to those differences can be sometimes a painful and difficult process, it really is what calls us to act and to change and to take responsibility for the inequities or injustices before us. And that's what I really see some of the work of the Women's Center at DePaul, what we were really trying to do. We have a slogan, or kind of not a slogan, but kind of a theme that's called "We all belong here. We will protect and defend one another." And the assumption is that the we has to be created, that we have to build a we that is based in not just similarities, but our differences, and how can we build solidarity across these hierarchies and divides in order to create a solidarity where we could disrupt these systems, to call out the injustices, to build the community that really, I think many people yearn for, a community where people are really valued for who they are and valued in their differences, not just their similarities, but valued in all of who we are and all of who we are becoming. And in order to do that, that means we have to really, to really listen and recognize and be accountable for the actual things that are going on, in our community at DePaul and beyond. So I guess on that note, I hope that was clear or helpful in some way. And I'll turn it over to Stephanie.
Well, you got me thinking a lot. And as you were talking, I started scribbling all these adjectives to describe me because I think they're important. But one of the things that I want to say for those of you who are out there in cyberspace is my first kind of thinking about this notion of intersectionality and who am I in the grand scheme of the world, I would say for me started when I moved into the workforce outside of the comfort of being at home and then in a university setting where we are often a part of communities that are insulated from the world at large. So when I think about who I am, the adjectives that I described are over 50. I won't be more specific. Black, a straight woman, grew up in the South, lived in the North, lived in the Midwest. I'm simultaneously an HBCU alum, a University of Chicago alum, a large public university alum. I am a sports junkie. I'm a Protestant. I'm an ally. I'm politically active. I'm someone who is fiscally conservative and extremely socially liberal. And so the reason I mention this is because often in a workplace, when we are put in small quarters with people who are not like us, the notion of who we are often is challenged, but also our ideas of who other people are in relation to us, and how do their worlds collide with us. And so the reason I bring that up is when I spent a lot of years at JP Morgan, and while I was there, I ran the recruiting committee for the division that I was in, as well as the evaluation committee. And we were charged in some respects with, identifying talent and bringing them into the institution and shepherding them as they were there. And often workplace conflict you get involved in because you see that people are often resistant to the idea of people thinking differently than them, right? And so when we think about intersectionality, one of the things that I've been having conversations in this particularly charged environment, this moment in history, is the grace to accept people who think differently than you, even if they look like you, because that is a part of this notion of understanding what intersectionality means, right? And for those of you who are out there on this call, one of the things I think is important is, of all of the adjectives that I said that I am all of them simultaneously, but I may not frame my existence in all of them simultaneously because the calling card may be different depending on the setting. And that's normally the case for most people. The sports junkie shows up at some place, but the church girl shows up in another place. And while those may seem like funny extremes, I think it's the dialogue of that goes on inside you of your multiplicity talking to each other at the same time, but it's also the dialogue that you're having with folks outside of you to understand, how do I deal with the resistance to me, right? That's the nature of being oppressed. But also, how do I deal with my resistance of the beings of others? And so again, I take it back to this very important inflection point we are in the history of this country, where for the first time, a lot of us are grappling with notions of who are we and why does that matter in relation to who others are. And so I think that this is an important time for people to have questions about navigating those spaces, both in the workplace, at school, in the world, and having open and honest conversations. So I'll give an example. I was having a chat with someone about what it means to be an ally. And the first thing you have to be a good ally is to be a good listener, right? Because you have to open yourself up to the possibilities of what life is. But I also will say, in the expectation of wanting or needing allies, you also have to be an ally, right? Because the universe kind of sends out these opportunities for you to be an ally for certain people, with the expectation that on the other end, you're going to receive some allyship. So that's kind of it for me. I think that was important. April, I am open now to, putting this, time out for people who may have questions, and filling in, on what's on their mind, and also, talking a little more if you want to open the floor.
Thank you so much, Anne and Stephanie. So at this time, if anyone in the audience has any questions or comments about what our presenters were saying that they'd like to ask, feel free to put that in the chat box.
I'm particularly interested in people asking about navigating, challenges at home and at work, in the moments that we're in. So any questions about that, I'm certainly open to.
Stephanie, I did have a question, and it's very specific to the workplace, I think. There's always there's traditionally, historically, been this idea of a corporate culture, an organizational culture, where, you know, same ideology and thought process. Do you feel, and has it been your experience, that someone's individual cultural identity will necessarily negate that corporate culture?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I understand that my framing of this comes from having been in the space of accounting and finance. And I think that's important because I think it's a space where even in 2022, that people are expected to wear the uniform and speak the language. But what the Great Resignation has taught us is that who people are on the inside at times will outweigh who they think of themselves within the corporate uniform, right? Because people are at a space in time where the freedom to be themselves is way more important than the freedom to be constrained by these artificial notions of self that are imposed on them. What I will say though, the challenge is to understand, and this is the work we all have to do, is to understand upfront the kind of organization you are going to be employed in. And this will be an example for people, because I've been reading a lot about the challenges that large corporations are having right now. We're having it at DePaul. I'm sure many employers are having it, is whether or not I am going to have the freedom to work from home, or whether or not I am going to be forced back into the office, right? Because what many of us learned, and I won't say what side, you know, I think is right or wrong. I don't think there's a right or wrong, but I think that some people went back into bubbles of similarity where they didn't have to think about the way the world worked, right? And so that was a comfort zone for them. But some people went back into their homes to escape the resistance to their identity, right? So there were a lot of people that found comfort in being at home because they didn't have to deal with the stress of resistance to their sexual identity, their racial identity, their what you fill in the blank. And it became a more productive environment for them. On the other hand, there are people who are chomping at the bit to get back into the work space, not place, the workspace, the physical space, you know, because of this notion of being able to connect with people who are like them, whatever that means. And so I think this is an environment that the choices that we make going forward are going to be more informed out of sense of who am I in relation to the workplace, and not just in relation to the workplace on a standalone basis. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. We also do have another question that came in the chat box. Lasasha said, so do you feel that nowadays people are even more self-conscious about being themselves in the workplace during these times from the effects of the pandemic?
So
that could be either one.
I want to say this from my perspective, Lasasha, because this is a challenge that I've been having. So you might be able to help me with it. So when the pandemic started, I went into my hibernation at home that involved eating all the time. I didn't wear clothes much other than like sweatpants and socks walking around, and I worked all day. And so my challenge in going back is I went back to work heavier than I left the workplace. And so there are self-conscious parts of me that have come up in the return to the workplace that have challenged me personally in my identity of how I see myself that did not exist before. So the question that you asked in particular, you know, was, are people more self-conscious? I think there are people who are more self-conscious. over a litany of things. But I also think there are a lot of people who learned a new kind of freedom and self-acceptance while they were at home that makes them think about their place in the world in a very different way. And so I think there are two sides to that coin that you'll see going forward. But I'm going to let Ann, say what she thinks on this.
No, really, I agree with you. I mean, I think coming back, like I know a lot of people where it's hard to come back. It's hard to come back into environments they feel that are not accepting or haven't been accepting. And so the levels of anxiety and stress, I think for some people is really increased. And then, there's always inequity on who gets to stay at home and who has to go back to work. So I think there's those inequities also that I think are really also stressful, but I do think it's also interesting, and I hadn't thought about it because I think the people I've talked to are more like the stress of having to go back and to deal with the microaggressions and the non-acceptance or the feeling of like you're in a battle or you're not in an affirming place, but also but I hadn't thought about people who feel like maybe different because they had this time, where they felt better about who they were, or, are coming back in a stronger, from a stronger stance. So I think it's good to think about both those, because I don't think it's all one thing or the other. But I know I just feel like anxiety is higher for a lot of people, because there was a certain kind of freedom of being at home. And I mean, even Zoom, you can turn off your thing, or you can, I don't know, there's all these ways that, people could probably breathe more, and just and be relaxed. So I don't know, I don't have any scientific thoughts on it, but that's what I would say.
No, I totally agree. There's another comment for our children. I have a 14-year-old son who's a student athlete. I'm struggling with his options for high school. I do not want him to attend a private institution where he has to be one of 25 people of color. I would prefer him to remain in our community. What can you share about this from an educational and college preparation standpoint?
So I don't know who asked this question, but I'm going to share with you some of my personal journey. I don't have children, but all of my friends are at the stage where your child is. And so it's a conversation I've had a lot. And I'm going to frame this from the standpoint of someone who grew up, and I'm wrapping this because I think it's important to answer the question. So my father was a pilot, my mother was a professor. I am the fourth generation professor on one side of my family and the third on another. So a lot of people with PhDs. I went to an HBCU where there were certainly microaggressions, right? Even in a place where you are surrounded by people who look like you. And I was a sorority girl, so there were microaggressions, unfortunately, that I imposed on other people. I left there. I moved from the South to the Northeast. I moved to New York, which brought on a different set of microaggressions. I left there. I went to the University of Chicago. There were a different set of microaggressions. In a class of 800, I was one of 8 Black people in the early 90s. I left there. I went to JP Morgan in the private bank, which was the bank of billionaires. And then I went to Rutgers, one of the largest public institutions, but also one of the 8 oldest institutions in America. The reason I say that is because along the way, each of them was an opportunity to understand where there's resistance to my existence, right? And I am not certain that there was more of an issue when I went to the University of Chicago, the elite private school from Rutgers. It was just framed often differently, right? So what I will say, unfortunately, is that in America, educational access is often determined by where you go to school. When I talk to my friends who are contemplating sending children to high school, my frame of reference is always to say, go to the best high school that the child can get into. Because so much of what we do from that point on, so in some of these spaces, people start thinking about where their children will go to college in utero, right? Because that's how they have been socialized. The doors that might open from the school that he goes to may have generational impact. And so what I will say is, even if you think that your child may go to a place where there are not microaggressions, there likely are. So you have to put a circle of love around them no matter where they go to deal with the unique challenges, but understand what the challenges are. Talk to parents of other people who've gone to those schools and understand that your support of him as a student athlete is setting up where his grandchildren will be able to go to college. So please feel free to ask a follow-up. That's just my opinion on it, but I'll let Ann move on from there.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. Just that I think the idea of asking other people what they're doing and, talking with him, I think there are all these different trade-offs no matter what you do. They're just trade-offs, and I don't think there's one answer. But I do think that it's helpful. I think everything that Stephanie said and just encouraging, like having people to talk it through with, and other people who've gone through it, I think can be the most helpful. And everything matters, it's also like how he responds to the different environments. I guess that would be one other thing I would just think about, because sometimes people, it's the quality of life and like where he's going to end up, being able to navigate all of that. So I don't think I'm helping at all, but those are my thoughts.
We do have another question. Can you talk about the challenges of DEI and belonging initiatives in the workplace in relationship to women of color? At times, it seems that demographic is pushed behind others.
So I like, as always, I will start this with a personal story. So the former chairwoman of the American Institute of CPAs is a woman of color, Kimberly Ellison Taylor. And I was talking to her this week. She was named to the board of US Bank. And I was saying how I had included the story about this in my class news packet for the week. And a student chose to go interview at US Bank because to them, that was a signal that that was something that they valued. And when they looked at some other financial institutions that had, no Black women on their board, they thought it was a signal of something they didn't value. So I think there is a precarious balance that we are walking on what organizations matter. Taken to consideration that I am coming from this, having spent 12 years working on Wall Street, where unfortunately in America, we have a lot of performative actions on the part of corporations who often have DEI programs that they never intend to be successful, but they are a signal to constituents out there, hey, we're doing this stuff, and we just want you to know that we're doing it. Where what they really care about are these other things that are more akin to only shareholder value. So the frame that I often come to when I'm talking to people about the workplace is this is why it is important to see what organizations are putting their money where their mouth is, not just announcing initiatives, right? But if they are a bank, are they really investing in community reinvestment? Have they eliminated redlining, which has destroyed, for example, neighborhoods all around the country? If they are an institution that is an educational institution, how have they tried to frame the integration of lots of different people into their student body, their faculty organizations, not just admitting them, right? Because admitting folks that you know may not be successful in your culture is a signal that that wasn't really that important to you. So who's really doing the work? And yeah, as a Black woman in America, I often feel like I am, the last person to be acknowledged for whatever things, but I speak up, right? And I think that when you think about like compensation, for example, someone just reminded me that Black women make, I don't know, 62 cents on the dollar for every dollar that a white man makes. So you mean to tell me and all my goodness, that I walk into a place and I am doing less, or I'm doing it less stellar? No, I am doing it probably more stellar, because otherwise I wouldn't have an opportunity to sit there, right? I wouldn't have an access to the same opportunity. So what we have to do is community building in our workplaces. And this is where the notion of being an ally comes in. So now I am in a place where I can shift the conversation to what about if we think about this person, right? So each of us has an opportunity, almost a responsibility, to be an ally for people that we feel like may be the least thought of in their workplace communities. And sometimes, that means we have to be willing to challenge the status quo. Now, keep in mind, I understand not everyone can challenge the status quo successfully, but speaking up is something everyone can do. So when I said thinking about, this whole list of things that I am, there are times when I need Ann Russo's of the world, white women, to be my ally, but I can't just take from her allyship. I have to then give that allyship to someone else who may be a Hispanic man. Sometimes it may be a white man, because not all diversity can we see, right? And we have to be willing to understand that sometimes diversity is so much broader than this idea of who does one look like. I'll give you an example, and then I'm gonna go, because this I could talk about a lot. So one of the things that I have had to check myself on is this notion of people who have different political viewpoints than I do. And while we don't have to go into my viewpoints, one of the things I have to say is it is okay for someone to look like me and not think like me, right? And so that is this notion. So even as we advocate for Black women in the workplace, we have to recognize that Black women are not a monolithic group of people. Just as white women or white men or Asian men are not a monolithic group. So I will stop there, because that, I'll turn this over to Ann.
Well, first, I think it's so important to recognize that none of us are in monolithic groups. Like there's so many differences, and that there's so many things going on under the surface. Like I always figured that out in my classes, where it looks like it's a very homogeneous group, but then when people start talking, people's identities are much more complex and layered than what I would ever think, right? And I do think that the question about is really an important one. About, at times it seems that the demographic of women of color is pushed behind others. And I think that's true, because I think that, there's this book that was done in the 80s called All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave. And it was like the development of Black women's studies. Really powerful book. But I think that idea of all the women are white and all the Blacks are men, that I've noticed like at in different workplaces, and I've seen this at DePaul, when people say, well, we need a women's perspective, the people that are imagined or the organizations that are formed are predominantly white women. And I think that's a problem, right? That this category of women's rights or women's ideas or even feminism is always associated with whiteness. And I think that's a lie, and that's not true. And yet I think it's the go-to, of like, well, hey, we have a lot of women in positions of power at DePaul. Yeah, but they're often white women, right? Or, so who's moving up into the system? Or this idea of like the glass ceiling. Well, it's women of color that came up with the idea of, well, there's also people that are stuck on the floor, like the sticky floor syndrome, right? So looking at, these hierarchies between and among women, I think is really important. So I think that's an issue that needs to be raised. And, there maybe need to be more specific platforms for different groups of women, or that recognition of differences, I think. Or making an intentional platform of when you're developing something around women, for instance, that there's leadership that represents, multiple groups of women instead of those who have the most privilege, sort of white, middle class, and professional women. So I think those kinds of initiatives need to be challenged around that any category, I think it's what you were saying, Stephanie, that any of these categories have also many differences within them. But the people who get most recognized are the ones with the most privilege. If you look at the history of the way that Kimberly Crenshaw, the reason that she came up with intersectionality is because discrimination law defined race as separate from gender. Yeah. So Black women's history of sexual harassment, of discrimination, included both race and gender. But because of that, they didn't look like the experience of white women or the experience of Black men. So the courts would rule that it couldn't be both race and gender. It had to be one or the other. And so you would have to show that your experience was like the whole category of whoever you were talking about. And so Crenshaw came up with that idea of intersectionality because, Black women or women of color are experiencing both race and gender, right? And you can't separate them. And so when these legal theories are created or these categories are used, it can make it so those that fall within and between categories or multiple categories, then their experience and the experiences they have are left out of the formula, because it was you had to say it was either race or gender. You couldn't say it was both. And so I think that's had a powerful impact. And just speaking of that, I just want to say something else that's really important, that actually the main lawsuits that were developed in the 70s around sexual harassment, for instance, were Black women, and so, and yet often weren't included, didn't win those suits because they didn't fit into this one categorical distinction. So
April, before you go to the next question, because I do think it's important, I just want to say, going back to this idea of the words resistance and comfort, right? So when we start talking about how did we get to this place, it really has to do with this one of comfort. So when organizations, because that's the way that I frame it, think about right now today, moving beyond performative action to one where DEI, belonging, all of these things are important. We have to remind ourselves that how we got here is because of this notion of people are living in comfort zones. So if I am a white male CEO and I am being charged with having to reform what my company looks like, and if DEI is something that I need to do, well, I'm going to go find people who are like me, right? In whatever form that means. So what we have to do, those of us who are women of color, is to stand and be heard. And it's often difficult. And the thing that I say to the young women of color that I encounter on DePaul's campus is sometimes when I stand out on that ledge, it is not about necessarily improving my lot today, because I might often be harming myself today, but hoping that there is some young woman who comes behind me who gets to stand as a beneficiary of my willingness to speak out. So for whoever asked that question, be that person too.
That's a great, thank you. That's a great statement to thinking about the future generations. Dr. Russo, I think you might be able to give a little advice. We do have 2 more questions before we wrap up. And so Marilyn wrote that she's a feminist and she is having a difficulty with some of the younger generations of feminists that have benefited from the activism and work and opening doors done by older women. Yet the younger generation seem unwilling to keep the ball moving forward. Do you have any suggestions on how she can overcome her biases?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I think young feminists are doing amazing work. I know there's some people who are, I don't know. I think there's many sides to this question. So I guess one thing I would say is that some young women and young feminists have rejected some of things that older feminists or earlier generations of feminists have done. And some of those critiques have been great because it's created new ideas and new movements and changes. And so, I mean, one thing, that's what I love about teaching is everybody's keeping me on my toes all the time. Like I have to rethink things. I mean, my feminism changes all the time. You know, it grows, it expands. I have to think more critically about things. And so I think that some of that, being able to kind of listen and see where people are coming from is the most important. And to realize that, you know, like some of the ideas I have are really limited. You know, I think ideas, like I've really been challenged to think about, you know, that idea I came up with at the beginning, like one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. And so thinking about trans people, gender non-binary people, like even what we think about that category is completely shifted. And young people are at the, you know, at the forefront of a lot of that. And young people are doing different kinds of activism and different kinds of work than we've been doing all along. And I think that that's good. I think movements are really, that's what a movement is about. You know, it's about lots of different ideas and perspectives and always being challenged and having to rethink things. And I think just being okay with the discomfort sometimes of those rejections and critiques. Like I think I've learned the most when people have challenged me, when I've been made to sit in my discomfort, that's where you really do the work of change. Not that you have to accept everything, but I think it's that discomfort and being willing to face those discomforts and being willing to be in the room with people who don't agree with you. You know, like, I think that's true that, you know, a lot of times students will say, well, you know, there's a group of students in the class, they're wrong. They don't agree with this feminism. Well, that's good. You know, like you want to hear what they have to say and try to work it out. Like a movement is not about a monolithic group that everybody agrees. It's about learning to live with the contradictions and complexities, and you know, that's where you're going to get real change. That's where you're going to build and expand a movement rather than think I can only create something with people who look like me, who talk like me, who believe everything that I believe. That's not a movement. That's like a, you know, that's a cult. No, that's not a dynamic movement for social and political change. So I think just trying to be more open. I guess that's what I would say.
Okay, and thank you both. We just have this last question, and thanks everyone who is still on the Zoom call. Can you talk about the role of public sector employees in modeling allyship and anti-racism behaviors practices?
So one of the things I was thinking about when I saw the question, so my grandfather got a PhD in math and ended up having to go work at the post office because when he got his PhD in math, most universities in America would not hire him. including the public universities that his tax dollars supported. So when I think about the role of public sector employers, especially today in modeling allyship, as an accounting professor who teaches governmental accounting, I always say to my students, we don't refuse someone's tax dollars if they're gay, if they're a lesbian, if they're a Muslim, if they're transgender, Black, white, whatever. We don't refuse their tax dollars. So because we live in a system, a public system where people's tax dollars pay for the things that the public sector uses, we have an obligation to be inclusive. We have an obligation to make sure that people have opportunities that and I want to keep repeating this, that their tax dollars fund. And so when I think about, some of the debates that we're having in this present space of who has a right to be here, we have to remember that the public sector, the government, whether it's the state, local, or federal level, exists because of the dollars of the people, right? This is how we work. And so absolutely, the public sector has a right to set the tone for what it means to be an inclusive society, because what we don't want is what happened in the 60s, where we made sure that people paid their taxes and we excluded them from the largest sector of the economy. Because make no mistake, the public sector is 36% of the United States GDP, which is $20 trillion. So it doesn't take a calculator to say that's a whole lot of money, right? As an accountant, I can't even do the numbers. So yes, at every level, our government and the sectors allied with the government have an opportunity and a responsibility to model what it means to be inclusive. And I always go back to what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says, is that in this country, we do not discriminate on the basis of race, religion, gender. It should be amended to include sexual orientation and gender identity, because for God's sakes, we are in 2022. So anti-racism, and if I hear one more person talk about why they disagree with critical race theory without even being able to define what that means, yes, the government has a responsibility to model allyship, to model anti-racism, to model they have to be creating a world where anti-Semitism, whatever you put in, does not exist. Because if we model it in a public forum, we create better spaces for people to live in. And that's not just about being, nice. It's about productivity. Citibank says that racism has cost our economy trillions of dollars in productivity, because people in this country are not being empowered to live their best selves. So if we don't even do it because it's the right thing, it is the most economically sound thing that we can do for our economy. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Well, that was a great way to end this presentation, this webinar. Dr. Russo, Anne, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, that was a great way to end. I thought that was perfect. So thank you, Stephanie. And thank you, April.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Anne, for joining us tonight. It was a great discussion. And thank you, everyone, all the attendees who were able to make it tonight. This webinar has been recorded, and the recording will be available on the alumni website within the next 7 days. But feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions at a.garrett@depaul.edu. Thank you. Enjoy your night, everyone.